Story time with Ophelia. She's a badass. We now catch up with our two little heroes, a scrawny zombie and an even scrawnier human who got themselves sold so that they could attack an auction valet vehicle line. And they let a guy named Carl with his top hat go, taking almost all of the girls in his yellow van to a safe house that maybe exists. But they did it. They survived attacking an auction. The celebration. I stopped running and dragging Swan as soon as I could duck into the side alley out of earshot from the Rangers. I tried again to stop laughing. I stuffed half my shirt into my cheeks. I bit down on my arm, but I couldn't stop cracking up. I held my sides and covered my mouth with my sloppy green and black dripping fingers, my blood making its way down from the glass shrapnel wounds in my shoulders. Swan grabbed the length of twine that had been acting as my belt. She yanked it, and I followed behind her for a change, stumbling and clutching at the walls that I bounced off of as we ran, and I snorted. She hauled me as far as she could before her fingertips turned purple from pulling on my belt. She stopped to stare at me, hands on hips. I lost it again, choking on the hilarity of her having me on a leash, instead of Donnie, which I had more than half expected. Smoke was billowing up into the smoggy evening. Pillars from burned-out vans held up the sky. Our Molotov cocktail practice had paid off. All of those targets that we had painted onto bricks and all of those bricks that we had thrown had worked out. Our arms were true. Even dehydrated, starved, and dressed up in ripped burlap sacks, our aim was devastating. We had taken care of that. Sirens wailed in the distance, rangers checking to be sure that the auctioneers were okay, to comfort the wealthy buyers and make sure that Swan and I hadn't broken too many of their limbs. Somewhere near the old wharf, girls were getting out of a big yellow van into a safe house, confused as to why they were now not wives, dependent on a strange man named Carl for food and shelter. Probably, if his safe house was real. If it was real, they had gone from being neat to needing it like everybody else. Except for me. I hiccuped. I hoped that Carl wasn't a fraud. I would check up on him after we were clothed and sane, if Uncle Donnie didn't find us now. My shoulders quaked and rolled. I opened my mouth wide and howled at the cloudy place where the moon should have been. I rasped as my diaphragm, if I still had one, squeezed out the waves of laughter that ended with a gurgle. I fell down, my ribs revolting and sloshing my insides into a cyclone. I wondered if I was making puddles on the asphalt. I didn't care. We won. We've done it, and I can't stop. Swan finally joins in my foolish celebration. She peered at the entrance to the alleyway that we had ducked into, and finding it empty, she pranced and skipped and twirled across the potholed terrace, not tripping a bit, pumping her arms furiously to the tune of her own hoots and whistles. She bounced up and down, swirling in the garb of the girls she had freed. No girls had been owned in that auction, all because she had grown smart and skilled. Swan had taken care of that. I rocked from side to side, cackling into my elbow. My torso tingled and my ears bounced against the concrete. She knelt beside me. Ophelia? I tried to stop. I panted. I should stop. She brushed my fringes from my clammy forehead. Ophelia, are you okay? We did it! We did it, Swan! We attacked an auction. We didn't die. Nothing went wrong. Nobody died. We did it. You're right. We did it. She danced another lap around the alley. We did it. We did it. We did it, she chanted. Swan snatched my wrist and held it up like a champion, showing us to the unwatching world, grand and victorious with nobody to see, everyone tending our fires. We had defeated everything laid in our paths, a zombie and a little girl, beaming from gray-green cheek to strawberry blonde curl. I howled. Sirens answered me. But Swan fell quiet. Her hand on my wrist went slack. She stumbled backwards, dabbing at an open cut on her palm, where her poker had rubbed away her fair skin into popped open blisters. My smile fell. It tingles, she stuttered. It tingles. She looked at the open cut on her hand and then down at me through the tears forming in her eyes. She cringed away from my clotting, uncovered arms and shuddered. I got it in my cut. It tingles. Swan, I got to my feet. I told you not to touch. I'm sorry. Oh, no. No. I am so sorry. I never should have. I'm so sorry. Oh, Swan, no. Not you. I tried to focus my eyes on her turned back. She swayed now instead of celebrating. I crept up behind her to see what I had done, to see what I could do. Maybe she wasn't really infected. Maybe I hadn't really killed her. Maybe she was just lightheaded. She let me pry her fingers away from her wound. I peered into the pink, pulpy palm. Such small cuts. How could such a small mistake let in such a big hurt? Tonight. But it had finally happened. I hadn't saved her. I had killed her. I've killed Swan. She half sat, half fell to the concrete. I caught her and then thought better of it, pulling away. She grabbed my arms and held me tightly. It's okay, she said. I have it now. You can't give it to me again. Don't worry so much, Ophelia. Swan, oh, Swan, I am so sorry. I brushed a red curl out of her eyes. I knew you shouldn't touch me. I'm so sorry. We should have run. I should have run. I couldn't leave you. I wanted to take care of you. She labored to breathe as a small river of gray tears poured from the corners of her eyes. I should have let her eat more over the last few weeks. She was so small. The infection was taking her quickly. She was already burning up and sweating and shaking. I'm so sorry, I mouthed, burying my face in her rags, still rocking. Maybe you can keep me like that other thing you have living in your apartment. I stuttered. Oh, don't worry. If you try to ditch me, I'll just follow you home again. She tried to giggle and then coughed, like I did that first time. Swan, I rocked her gently. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll understand if you can't keep me. She rattled, and clotting spittle splattered her freckled chin. Of course I'll keep you, I checked her pulse. Maybe you're immune anyway. Maybe you'll be like me. Let's just wait and see. Sure, I'm gonna miss you, she said, her head lolling off to one side. You won't miss me. You'll wake right back up. You hear me? It all tingles. My stomach tingles. I love you. She fainted against my lap. I love you too. I didn't let her limp, battered knuckles hit the cement. I held onto her hands. I stroked her damp hair away from her mouth. I put 2 fingers on the side of her soft, clammy neck. Her heartbeat slowed. It was slow. Too slow. And then it stopped. I couldn't feel any more movement, not even seizures. I leaned into her belly, pushing my face into it, willing her blood to return to normal, or to stay still, just not to reverse. I willed her to be like me. I inhaled deeply, forcing myself to memorize her salty, tea-soaked scent. She stirred. Please. I turned my waxy gray face up to the obscured yellow stars. Please. She grabbed a fistful of my hair and brought my head to her mouth. She took a bite. I felt my scalp tingle where it ripped away, dripping more black blood onto her. She was not immune. She was not like me. I had killed her. I gently but firmly held her hands down to her sides, careful of her skin that would never heal ever again. Her poor bony hands, I would have to bandage them over and over again, forever, every time she got them dirty. I would keep her as she had asked. She couldn't hurt me. How could I hurt her more? Could I ever take care of anything? I tried to pull her onto my lap like I would Juliet, but she was too big. No matter how I held her, she turned and gnawed on my collar or my shoulder. Her left arm snapped slightly under the pressure of my restraining hug. She twisted her hips into my belly and lunged for my neck, teeth gnashing behind her purple-blue lips. Even emaciated, she was too big to keep indoors. But I had no tool shed, no chicken wire or yard to make her a fence. She needs a tower, a barn, a roof. I thought of our roof, the upper floors of the building overrun with squatters, and the rain collection troughs that they defend with spiked clubs. Swan needs an empty, quiet roof, a place that I could tend to daily, with a sentry who would keep others away. The clinic. The floors above the clinic are almost always empty. So few squatters. Almost everyone is suspicious of the doctors who can't stop the plague and can't treat the poor's rotten teeth. Only the most desperate infected squatter would try the floors above the distrusted clinic. And I hadn't noticed many freshly infected since I'd been watching buying and selling dirtbags instead. I could give Swan to Jim. I could apologize for stealing supplies, let him smile at me and make jokes about rangers who trip over their own belts, while he smashed in her head, like I had taught him. I could thank him for the book, let him do the right thing and take care of Swan. He hadn't had any real zombies to practice on in a while. I could let him have Swan, and she'd have a final piece, and then he'd hug me and tell me that everything was okay. Until I dripped on him and made him sick too, while breaking my promise to Swan, before Jim could come up with a cure. I told Swan that I would keep her, and I told Jim that it isn't safe to keep zombies after they turn. I taught that. No keeping zombies. It's not safe. Except to me. Not until there's a cure. And if I left him alone and uninfected, he could make us all that cure. I would have to keep Swan and my sorrow to myself. I would hide her on the vacant roof of the clinic, but not tell Jim, whom I had already robbed and who I needed busy with science. I would lock everybody else out of her isolated, almost protected building. Another task for a big sister. I love you too, I told her and dragged her towards the main street to the clinic. Come on, Swan. I don't want to go either, but we can't stay here. I tugged her behind me by twisting her skirt into a harnessed lead, while she grappled for my kneecaps with wiggling fingers. We approached the clinic from the side opposite the delivery door, with a dank, dull air muffling our arrival. We were silent relative to the hiss of the steam grates and the occasional rumble of an obliviously passing truck. But I wished that Jim would see us avoiding him. I wanted him to forgive me for robbery. I wanted him to offer us a good home. I wanted him to not judge me for keeping her, to take her into the lab and fix her with a cure, to watch over her while I sat and wept into his arms. But I couldn't cry onto his fragile skin, or he would die too, and the cure would never be finished, or he would kill Swan even after I admitted that love and fate was more important than my training, or his. Swan gnawed on my scalp while I piggybacked her up the fire escape. Our fluffy orange bobs mingled in our black blood-twisted embrace. I didn't have to tell her to hold on tight. She braced me to her mouth like I was fresh possum steak. Ha! I know you haven't had much to eat, but geez, take it easy. No need to swallow me all at once. I'll come see you every night. Oh, man, you are lucky I can still heal. The floors above the clinic were as abandoned as I had hoped. The only other resident squatters had changed into zombies days earlier. Poor things. They had no one to love them and lock them up, safe until a cure is done. Nobody to give them peace by crushing their skulls. Swan cavorted with them until they lay motionless on the floor, smashed by my effortless, numb motions. I couldn't let all these things gallivant around until the cure was ready. Swan, it'd be nice if I could give you a roof over your head, but it'd be too hard to block off a whole floor for you, and you're big enough that you could use some wide open spaces and fresh air. She followed me swiftly up the last set of stairs. She had no major injuries to impair her speed or mobility yet. Her gait was still perfect and not hindered by the permanent injuries that she would collect until she could be cured. Only a few small cuts on her hands and feet. Just blisters, really. But they needed bandages to hide the peels that would never re-smooth. Not until the cure, since she wasn't immune. No part human anymore. That was left to me. I ripped off the bottom third of my dress, wrapping the strip around her palms and tying a small knot while I kept it aloft, all 5 fingers pointing towards my throat. Don't worry, nothing will hurt anymore. It'll only tingle. I lugged a large mildewing water barrel over near the door so that she could sip from it when she got thirsty. I splashed my fingers on the surface until she found it and plunged her entire head into the murky tub. She gulped and gulped until water trickled down her legs, and then she whipped her soggy head backwards, roared and thundered away after a rat that was trying to steal eggs from a pigeon's nest. Swan would have loved those eggs, but now she'll only chase after the raw guts that run away from her. The water in her barrel was tasty and refreshing in my belly too, but as soon as I locked the door between her and I, with her on the other side, stuck on the roof, dead, I bent over my knees and retched, vomiting black soup down the staircase in front of me. It poured out of me as fast as I had swallowed it down. I tried to catch it in my cupped palms and shovel it back inside of me. Even mildewed water is precious. But every time I heard Swan roaming across the rooftop, green and scarred, it spurted back out of my nostrils, unwilling to stay in my undeserving body. I flopped on my belly, pressed against the uneven floor, purging the contents of my stomach with sorrow. I relaxed my fists again against the already broken boards. Hearing my sighs, Swan banged back at me on the roof door to come out and follow me home. I wiped my lips and stood up out of my puddles. I'm sorry, Swan, you'll have to stay here. I'll be back to see you tomorrow night. She banged again in protest. Don't do that, you'll hurt your hands. I'll bring you better bandages tomorrow. Don't bang, your poor hands. Your poor hands. I'll be back tomorrow. I trailed my fingers down the side of the door, feeling the full impact of her punches. I backed away down the stairs through the rivers of black water that I had set loose. I tried to vomit some more, but I was already empty. Somewhere in the city, girls who were still surprised not to be wives. Probably. Unless the Carl in the top hat really ran a brothel too. But no, they had a new life laid before them, thanks to Swan, who had given up hers. She had given them a second chance, and me endless chances. And I had taken all of hers away. I passed by a cubbyhole full of weasel babies on my way home and did not stop to make them into a dinner for Swan. She didn't need food anymore. I stumbled numbly to her apartment door. She didn't need her locks anymore, and I didn't want anybody else to hole up in there, so I chopped through the wood instead. My axe was too heavy in my hands. I let it go and sat down in the middle of her floor. I opened my eyes only after my feet started to tingle from being folded too tightly beneath me, my sticky jaw popping as I turned my head, gouged where Swan had bitten me. But I would heal. Always a little messy. She hadn't bothered to make her nest of blankets any neater than standing up out of them the last time she had woken up. There were 3 empty tea mugs near her ratty pillow. Scraps of graphite-covered paper drifted below her uncurtained window. Her pencil rolled precariously near an old air grate. 2 mismatched shoes of the same size dangled by their laces from a broken hinge on a kitchen cabinet. There was an unopened can of beans on the counter. The bathtub faucet dripped into the bucket that she used to flush her toilet. A brisk draft toyed with her squeaky, never-closed closet door. The sun peeked in over her windowsill, and it was time for me to go to bed. I stood, put her pencil in my pocket, kissed her bookshelf goodbye, and patted it 3 times for each book that I left exactly where she had put it. I left her blankets rumpled on the floor, still looking ready to receive her. But I draped the clothes from her closet over my shoulder and filled up my arms. I took them to my own closet, threw them down on my ratty bed, and curled up under the leftover weight of her rainbow. I had taken care of nothing. Juliet was jealous of all the work that I had to do for Swan. The days were sweaty and humid, but every time I opened the curtains and window to let in some fresh air, Juliet tried to throw herself over the sill. Every time I put a load of laundry into the bathtub, she launched herself at the agitator rocks that I threw in to bang the dirt from the soiled fabrics. When I sat by the window sewing, hemming the holes that we had all put into our clothes, Juliet refused to chew on her old rag toy, instead favoring every garment that I tried to patch. I washed out the pots and pans that we used for water, but Juliet wouldn't drink out of the one that I put on the floor for her, even though it was full of cool, fresh water. She demanded the empty, drying ones that were out of reach on the counter, the ones I was trying to reserve for Swan. Oh, come on, Juliet. I fashioned her a new chew toy to keep her out of my already clawed hair. I tied some socks, too ruined even for arm warmers, into the shape of a baby doll and suspended it from the ceiling by a long strand of melted bungees that I joined over a candle. I let her have at it. She dove after the swinging decoy until she was sweating and seeping all over the floor. I didn't stop her from exerting herself. It didn't matter if she stained or tore the outfit that she was wearing. We had plenty of water, and we had just inherited a whole new wardrobe from Swan. It took forever for the clothes to dry in the moist summer air, draped over doorknobs in the back of the toilet and the curtain rods and stove door, a cornucopia of sweaters. It had rained socks and pants. I had hated all of Mom's stitching lessons, but now that I had 2 little ones to look after, I was glad to know how to fix everything instead of having to steal new ones. Swan was a little smaller than me, but her pants worked as my capris, and her long sleeves were perfect as 3/4 sleeves to hide some of my green skin. Her clothes were too big for Juliet, but I liked to dress Juliet in oversized pants and shirts that I could tie over her hands and feet to protect them from the rough floor. Aside from the few items I saved for Juliet and I packed up a bundle of clothes for Swan herself and stowed them with a little engine that could, in a clean, empty pot that I was taking to the clinic roof. "Behave yourself until I get back, Juliet." I patted her on the head and hugged her again when she didn't want to let me go, but she was going to have to accept that I had another person to look out for now. "You need to share me with Swan, just like she's sharing her clothes with you." The door was always locked and barricaded. I assumed that a miserable drunk like Uncle Donnie wouldn't climb a fire escape, even if he had finally found me. I didn't speak to Jim, but I spied him sometimes on my way to the clinic roof. He often sat on delivered boxes with his thermos, for an hour or two, early in the night, reading books or scribbling on papers. His crutch was always within reach, but he hadn't bothered to retape the razor blades that were drooping off to one side. He occasionally scratched his nose and looked around, but I never let him see me. I just blew him one apology kiss per night, and then paced to the stairs on the other side of this building. The stairs up to the roof were stuffy and stale, waves of rotten stench rippling through the air. Each step creaked with abandon and threatened to burst with swollen decay. I opened all of the windows as I climbed, letting the fumes seep out into the night. I killed a dehydrated, sweat-slippery zombie on the 3rd floor, where he had set up a little camp before he had changed sometime in the last day. I was glad that it couldn't feel my grief as I piled it into a heap in the very building where the cure was probably already being tested. But it gave me comfort to practice an old chore and to grant peace to at least one sad monster. Swan stumbled over to me when I unbarred her roof door. She was warm enough to run, but she hadn't had any water since I left her, having forgotten where her water barrel was, so she wobbled on dehydrated feet. I stooped to fill her new water pot. When she heard the splashes, she let go of my shins and stuck her head into the shining bowl, sucking the liquid through her mouth and nose. She would have taken the water through her ears and eyes, too, if they would have allowed it. She only raised her head when the pot needed refilling. I obliged, sloshing more water from the barrel, but it was almost empty. I hoped it would rain soon, to break the heat and fill her containers. Gray sweat dripped silently out of our pores, while Swan gnashed at the bundle in my hand. Yes, these are for you. Let's put them on. I laid them out in the order that I would twist them onto her, and then grasped her and winced when my fingertips touched her bare skin, blushing and cursing my squeamishness. I couldn't infect her anymore. I held her tighter and pulled the rag dress off. She didn't need the costume anymore. She shredded the freshly repaired hem of my tank top while I stuffed her head and then her arms into her favorite, freshly patched t-shirt, the one with a horse running underneath a smiling globe of sunshine. It rolled up to her ribs and flashed her concave belly until I could pin her and tug it down over her jagged shoulder blades. The pants were more difficult. Every time I got one leg in, she thrashed and rolled, threatening to rip the seams of her skin open on the cement. Now, Swan, you're too big for that. Listen to me. You need to settle down. I braced her against an old tarp. I sat on her belly and heaved the pants up to her hips, where I buttoned and lashed them with a length of twine. She scrambled away from me, after a raccoon scurrying along the cinder blocks. I struggled to catch her attention with our favorite picture book. Even when she had been alive, it had been one of the only things that would keep her still. I cleared my throat and opened to the first page. Chuck, 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 puff, 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 ding, dong, ding, dong. A tiny red train rumbled over the tracks. Her fiery hair clung to her slick, slimy forehead, barely waving in the heavy heat. She snapped at a surprise bug that flitted past her face. She missed it and hurried along on its way, 10 feet higher in the air. I cleared my throat and carried on. The toys were not the only thing carried by Tiny Red Train. The Tiny Red Train carried all sorts of good things. Big golden oranges, red-cheeked apples, and bottles of creamy fresh milk. She snarled at me and leapt for the book. I stood up and stomped my foot on the empty crate that was my stool. The boom rang out and echoed off of the opposite walls. She crouched and sprang at the splintering corner of the box. She grabbed my pant leg in one hand and shook it back and forth, reaching higher and higher from my waist. She bit my thigh and sank her teeth into my green muscle, ripping out a hunk and chewing it lasciviously. I knocked her on the head with my fist and punched her off of my knees. Stop it, Swan, you're too big for that. Now stop, I said stop. She clawed at my shirt, reaching higher and higher, groping for my neck and then my face. One of her fingernails ripped my bottom lip in half. I slapped her hard across her left ear. She spun around with the force of it. An empty rolling bottle caught her eye, and she was off like a fly on a dead cow, racing across the roof on all fours. It rolled out of her reach over and over again. The bandage on her hand came loose and trailed behind her. Swan, I'm sorry. Come here and let me fix that. She growled and gnashed when I held her between my knees and rewrapped the unhealing wound on her hand. I wondered if it still tingled. I hoped not. I couldn't hold her for long. She was bigger than Juliet and wriggled herself loose. She tackled me by the ankles. Okay. I chuckled as she worked her way up me. That's enough roughhousing. That's enough. I rolled on my stomach, pushing myself up with her on top of me. She wouldn't let go. I said that's enough. I slammed my back into the wall that enclosed the stairway. She writhed and lost her grip on my neck. She fell to the ground where another empty bottle caught her eyes, and she scampered away after it. I sighed. She needed a distraction, something to chew on that wasn't me. I ducked below the roof, prying half-rusted nails out of the wall of the abandoned rooms. I collected broken table legs, handrails, cords, ropes, and tacks on a makeshift sled of moldy cardboard and hauled it up to the roof. Swan pulled a flap of braided cord off of the sled and ran away with it, ravaging the center of the otherwise ruined piece. I chased her and took it back before she could rip it into too many pieces, tethering her to the mountain of broken cinder blocks. I built the base first, using some of the heavy bricks that were usually only useful for smashing toes. I coughed a cloud of dust and my chest tingled. I wondered if zombies could get asbestos poisoning, and I tied a rag around Swan's mouth just in case. I stopped using my lungs while I was building. I made 6-foot piecemeal poles and hefted them into place. The second and third poles weren't difficult to prop together after I wrestled the first one to stand up in the base. I used bent and broken nails to pin metal and plastic pipes to a tripod. I reinforced the peak with rag lashings and the base with hefty clumps of debris. With my pencil in my mouth, my fingers framing it, the tripod looked stable. I grinned at my work and set about the last piece of the new toy. I emptied a plastic bottle of its scummy rainwater. It was crinkled with holes in the neck and the bottom. Perfect. I sliced fins from can lids and aluminum scraps and stuck them to the bottle. They jutted out at complementary angles that I sanded to be smooth and dull. I dangled a spinner by one end of the rope that I tied securely to the top of the pyramid. The fins caught the wind and spun the bottle around and round, darting back and forth between the poles. It was a perfect zombie toy. I untied Swan so that she could get a good look at it. She sprinted to her new challenge, leaping at the spinner, dancing up on 2 feet, hands in the air. She caught it and wrestled it into her teeth. It snapped out of her reach. Surprised, she looked about and found it out of the corner of her eye, and lashed out again. She chased it in circles, back and forth as it bounced and jerked away. She was happy with her new toy, as happy as a zombie living on a roof with 2 torn hands and only rats for company could be. Okay. Good night.